I need to tell you about the blue folder first, not the divorce papers, not the courtroom, not the lawyer's office, not the particular silence of a marriage ending in a room full of fluorescent lighting and people who charge by the hour. Those things come later. What comes first, what everything else depends on, is a Tuesday afternoon in October of 2016. A blue folder I was never supposed to find, and the specific quality of stillness that descends on a person when they are holding evidence that rearranges everything they thought they knew about their own life. My name is Serena Voss. I was 34 years old, married for 6 years to a man named Clifton, living in a house we had bought together in 2013 with a down payment that had come mostly from my savings and entirely from my labor. We had a guest bedroom we called the office, a backyard that needed work we kept meaning to get to, and a marriage that I had spent the better part of 2 years quietly trying to diagnose, turning it over in my hands like an object that had changed weight without changing shape, trying to understand why something that looked the same felt fundamentally different than it used to. I was good at not seeing things I didn't want to see. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. I was not naive. I was a woman who had chosen, repeatedly and with full adult agency, to accept explanations that required me to look slightly to the left of what was actually happening. The late nights Clifton explained as work pressure, the phone that was always face down on the table, the way certain conversations ended before they had really started, redirected with a smoothness that I had mistaken, for years, for emotional maturity. It wasn't emotional maturity. It was practice. The blue folder was in the filing cabinet in the office. In the drawer I never opened because it was Clifton's drawer, the one that held his professional documents and tax records, and the kind of paperwork that accumulates in a life and requires occasional consultation. I was not looking through his drawer. I want to be clear about that, not because it changes anything, but because the truth of how you find something matters to how you understand what you found. I was looking for our 2014 joint tax return because our accountant needed it for an amended filing. Clifton was at work. I knew roughly where the tax documents were organized. I opened the drawer, found the tax folder, and when I pulled it out, the blue folder came with it. Caught on the tax folder's edge, dragged into visibility by the ordinary accident of proximity. It fell on the floor. I picked it up. I should have put it back. I know that. Some part of me knew it in the exact moment I held it. Knew that the folder had a particular weight that was not the weight of professional documents, that the way it was tucked behind the tax folder rather than filed with anything else meant it had been placed there to not be found. I knew all of this. I opened it anyway. Inside were printed photographs, 14 of them, 4 by 6, the kind you order from an online print service and receive in a small cardboard envelope. They were photographs of Clifton with a woman. Not professional photographs, not the kind of images that have innocent explanations, personal photographs, intimate in their framing and their content, taken in places I recognized and places I didn't. I recognized a restaurant on the waterfront that Clifton had told me was a client dinner venue that he had been to 4 times in the past year without me. I recognized our car, parked somewhere I didn't know. I recognized the particular way Clifton smiled in 2 of the photographs, a smile I had not seen directed at me in a very long time, open and unguarded and completely present in a way that felt, looking at it from the outside, like a rebuke. I did not recognize the woman. I stood in the office for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the floor. Somewhere outside, a dog was barking at something. The ordinary world continued its ordinary business around the specific implosion happening inside me, indifferent in the way the ordinary world always is to the moments that reorganize everything. I looked at every photograph, carefully, completely. I did not allow myself to look away or to reach for the explanations that my brain, well trained in looking slightly to the left, immediately began to generate. There were no explanations. There was only what was in front of me. When I finished, I put the photographs back in the blue folder, put the blue folder back in the drawer in the exact position I had found it, and took the tax return to the kitchen table where I photographed it for the accountant. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and I thought, not emotionally. I would do the emotional thinking later, in the shower that night with the water running so Clifton couldn't hear me, in the 3 a.m., hours when I lay beside him in our bed and listened to him sleep with a specific fury I had no container for yet. Right now, at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon, I thought practically, the way I had learned to think when the stakes were high enough that emotion would cost more than it gave. What did I know? Clifton was having an affair, had been having it long enough to print photographs and keep them, which meant long enough for the affair to have become, in his mind, something worth documenting, worth preserving. The photographs were not recent. I could tell from his jacket in one of them, a jacket he had stopped wearing 18 months ago when the lining tore. 18 months, minimum, possibly longer. What didn't I know? Who she was? How serious? Whether the marriage was, in Clifton's private accounting, already over and I simply hadn't been informed. What did I need to find out before I did anything? Everything. Because I had learned in 34 years of living that the moment you act on incomplete information is the moment you lose whatever advantage the information gave you. I had found the blue folder by accident. That accident was the only leverage I had. I was not going to spend it until I knew exactly what I was spending it on. I made dinner that night. I sat across from Clifton and I passed him the bread and I asked about his day and I listened to the answer with the full and focused attention of someone who is hearing a performance and cataloging every note. I watched his face. I watched his hands. I watched the way he looked at his phone when it buzzed and then looked at me to check what I had noticed. I had noticed everything. After dinner, I did the dishes, and Clifton watched television in the living room, and I stood at the kitchen sink with my hands in warm water, and I understood, with complete and terrible clarity, that the marriage I thought I was in had not existed for at least 18 months. I had been living in a house with a man who had built a second life inside our shared one, who had sat across from me at this table and passed the bread and watched television and slept beside me, and maintained the architecture of us while systematically hollowing out everything it was supposed to contain. The water in the sink went cold. I drained it, dried my hands on the kitchen towel. I went to the living room and sat beside my husband on the couch and watched television with him for 2 hours, and I did not say a single word about what I knew. The longest performance of my life! And I was just getting started. Here is what nobody tells you about discovering your husband's affair. The finding out is not the hardest part. The hardest part is the days immediately after. The ordinary Tuesday becoming ordinary Wednesday becoming ordinary Thursday. Each one requiring you to inhabit the same life you inhabited before, to speak the same words, perform the same rhythms, sleep in the same bed, while carrying in the sealed and pressurized chamber of your own knowledge the information that changes everything. The hardest part is the performance of not knowing, maintained for long enough that you actually know what you need to know to act. I gave myself 2 weeks. 2 weeks to gather what I needed before I did anything visible. 2 weeks of being Serena Voss, wife, in the daytime, and Serena Voss, investigator, in every private moment available to me. It sounds cold. It was cold. I had needed to be cold. I had learned, watching the blue folder fall on the floor and feeling the bottom drop out of the world I thought I lived in, that warmth was a luxury I could not afford until I understood the full dimensions of what had been done to me. The first thing I needed to know was who she was. I had the photographs. I had her face. A woman somewhere in her early 30s, dark hair worn short, a particular silver earring visible in 3 of the photographs that suggested consistency, someone who wore the same jewelry regularly. I had the restaurant on the waterfront, which Clifton had logged in our shared calendar as Meridian client dinner 4 separate times in the past 14 months. I am not, by profession or nature, an investigator. I am a project manager for a mid-sized architectural firm, which means I am, by both profession and nature, someone who tracks details, maintains timelines, and understands that complex problems do not yield to emotional responses. They yield to organized, sequential information gathering. I applied these skills to my marriage with the focused efficiency of someone who had nothing left to lose by clarity. I started with the restaurant. On a Thursday during my lunch break, I drove to the waterfront and went inside and spoke with the hostess, A young woman named B, friendly and unhurried, and told her I was trying to find the contact information for a woman I had met there several months ago, a regular, dark hair, silver earrings. I had lost her card. B said she didn't recognize the description specifically, but that their regular lunch crowd was fairly consistent, and if I came on a weekday between noon and 1, I might run into her. I did not do that, but the conversation confirmed that the restaurant had a consistent, regular crowd, that Clifton had not chosen it randomly, but had chosen it specifically because it was a place this woman frequented, which meant she lived or worked near the waterfront. The second thing I did was look more carefully at Clifton's phone habits. Not his phone. I never touched his phone, understanding that the moment he suspected I was looking, the performance would collapse before I was ready. But his habits around the phone, the angle at which he held it when he typed, the specific pause before he put it face down that meant he was waiting for a response, the way he excused himself to take calls in the backyard that he described when he came back in as work calls. I started leaving the back door slightly open when he took those calls. I heard enough. Not everything, not names, not specifics, but the tone of it. The particular register a voice takes when it is speaking to someone it loves. I had not heard Clifton use that register with me in a long time. Hearing it directed elsewhere through a slightly open door was the kind of confirmation that sits in your chest like a stone. On the 9th day of my 2 weeks, the identity arrived from a direction I had not anticipated. Clifton's company held a quarterly staff gathering, a Friday evening event at a downtown venue, the kind of loosely social, loosely professional occasion that spouses were technically invited to and I had attended twice in 6 years. I had not planned to attend this one. Then I decided I would. I wore a dress I had not worn in 2 years. I did my hair with care. I drove to the venue and walked in with the easy confidence of a woman who belongs in every room she enters, a skill I had developed professionally and deployed now for a different purpose. The room was arranged in the way of corporate social gatherings, clusters of people with drinks, the particular choreography of work relationships navigating the slightly unfamiliar territory of a social context. I found Clifton near the bar and stood beside him and smiled at his colleagues and accepted a glass of wine and read the room with the careful attention I had been training for 9 days. She was there in 40 minutes. I knew her before Clifton's body told me, before the fractional shift in his posture, the almost imperceptible redirect of his attention, the way his hand moved slightly toward his phone and then stopped. I knew her because the silver earrings were the same ones from the photographs, and the dark hair was the same, and the particular way she moved through a room suggested someone entirely comfortable in it. I watched Clifton not look at her. The performance of not looking at someone is, in its way, more revealing than looking. It requires a deliberateness, a sustained effort of redirection that reads clearly to anyone who knows what they're watching for. I watched her not look at him. I watched them perform, for the benefit of a room full of people, the exact performance I had been performing for 9 days, the effort of it, the cost. And then a man came to stand beside her, a man who had arrived late, who wore his jacket with the slightly rumpled ease of someone who had come from somewhere else, and not quite transitioned yet. He put his hand briefly on the small of her back in greeting, the casual physicality of people who are related or very long acquainted, and she leaned slightly toward him and said something that made him laugh. I looked at his face, and the floor shifted under me for the second time in 9 days, because the man standing beside Clifton's affair partner, the man whose hand rested briefly on her back, whose laugh she had just produced, who had arrived late with his jacket slightly rumpled and his face open and familiar and completely unknown to me until this moment, was her brother. And I recognized him. Not from photographs, not from a folder in a filing cabinet, from my own life, from my own past, from the specific geography of my own history, a face I had not seen in 11 years, belonging to a person I had not thought about in almost as long, connected now by the thinnest and most improbable thread to the center of the worst thing that had ever happened to me. I set my wine glass down on the nearest surface, very carefully. The room continued its ordinary noise around me. Clifton was saying something to a colleague on my left. The woman with the silver earrings was laughing at something across the room, and her brother, Declan Marsh, who I had known briefly and well in another life, who had disappeared from my world in 2005 when the circumstances that had brought us together dissolved, was standing 30 feet away, scanning the room with the unhurried attention of someone looking for a familiar face. His eyes found mine. He went completely still. I picked my wine glass back up, took a sip, looked away, and began, very quietly, to understand that the blue folder was not the whole story. It was only the first page. There is a specific kind of knowledge that lives in the body before it reaches the mind. I drove home from that corporate gathering on a Friday night in October with Clifton in the passenger seat talking about a colleague's promotion and the traffic on the bridge, and my hands were steady on the wheel and my responses were appropriately timed, and my face was doing everything a face is supposed to do in a conversation that doesn't matter. But underneath all of it, underneath the performance that had become, in 9 days, so practiced it barely required effort, something was moving through me that had no name yet. A current. The specific electricity of a coincidence so precise it stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like architecture, like something built rather than stumbled into. Declan Marsh. I turned the name over in my mind the way you turn something over in your hands to understand its dimensions. Declan Marsh, who I had known in 2004 and 2005 when we were both 22 and living in the same apartment complex in a city 3 hours from here, during the brief, specific season of my life that preceded everything that came after. Declan Marsh, who had been funny and unhurried and had owned exactly one good jacket that he wore to every occasion regardless of formality. Declan Marsh, whose sister I had never met, whose family I had never known, who had simply, the way people do at 22 before lives have fully calcified around their choices, disappeared from my orbit when I moved and he didn't, and neither of us had done the work to maintain the thread. Declan Marsh, whose sister was sleeping with my husband. The geometry of it was staggering, not impossible. The world is genuinely smaller than it appears, and the specific demographic mathematics of a mid-sized city mean that lives intersect in ways that feel supernatural but are merely statistical, not impossible, but staggering. What I did not know yet, what I would not know for several more days, not until the information arrived from a direction I was not expecting, was that the geometry was even more precise than I understood standing in that room with my wine glass, that the coincidence had layers, that what I was looking at was not the random overlap of two unconnected histories, but something with deliberate architecture, something that someone had built and someone had known about and someone had chosen, for reasons I could not yet see, not to tell me. I slept badly that Friday night. Clifton slept fine, the untroubled sleep of a man who did not know that the particular equilibrium he had maintained for 18 months was about to be disturbed. I lay beside him in the dark, and I thought about Declan's face in the moment he recognized me, the absolute stillness of it, the way all the social animation had drained out at once, replaced by something that looked, from 30 feet away across a noisy corporate gathering, remarkably like alarm. Not guilt, not the awkward surprise of running into someone from your past at an unexpected moment. Alarm, the specific expression of a person who has just seen something they did not want to see, for reasons that are not casual. That expression kept me awake for a long time. On Saturday morning, I told Clifton I was going to spend the day with a friend. He said fine with the ease of a man who was relieved by the space. And I drove across the city to a coffee shop 3 neighborhoods away from ours, and I sat in a corner booth and I thought, I was 10 days into my 2 weeks. I had the photographs, the timeline, the face, the name. Vivian Marsh. I had found it in the company directory on Clifton's firm's website, listed as an external consultant on 2 projects in the past 18 months. External consultant, the specific professional cover of someone who needed a legitimate reason to be in the building regularly without being on the permanent staff. I had found her LinkedIn, her professional photograph confirming what I already knew, her work history showing a consulting practice that had a number of clients in common with Clifton's firm. She had not stumbled into Clifton's professional world. She had cultivated access to it. I sat with that for a long time. Then my phone buzzed, a number I did not recognize. I almost did not answer. I had been screening calls carefully for 10 days, managing my visible life with the attention of someone who could not afford a single uncontrolled variable. But something made me answer. The same instinct that had made me open the blue folder. The instinct that had been right before. Serena. The voice was familiar in the way of things that have been stored and not accessed for a long time. A little deeper than I remembered, the same unhurried quality. Declan, I said. A pause. You knew it was me. I knew it was going to be you eventually, I said. I didn't know it would be Saturday morning. Another pause, longer. I need to tell you something, he said. I imagine you do, I said. Where are you? He was at a diner 4 miles from where I was sitting. I drove there and found him in a booth by the window. The rumpled jacket was gone, replaced by a sweater that was also slightly rumpled, because some things about a person are structural. And he stood up when I came through the door in the way of someone who has rehearsed the moment and found, now that it's arrived, that the rehearsal was inadequate. We sat across from each other. Coffee came. Neither of us touched it immediately. How long have you known? He asked. 10 days, I said, since I found photographs in a folder in our filing cabinet. Something moved across his face. He kept photographs? Printed, filed. I watched his reaction carefully. How long have you known? He looked at the window, at the street outside, the ordinary Saturday morning traffic of people with nowhere particular to be. Then back at me. 7 months, he said. 7 months. I kept my face neutral. You've known for 7 months that your sister was sleeping with my husband. Yes. And you didn't... I stopped, reconstructed the question into something more useful than an accusation. What did you do with the information? I told Vivian to end it, he said. 3 times. The first time was in March, when I found out. She told me it was already serious and she wasn't going to end it because of my discomfort. He paused on the word discomfort in the way of someone quoting language that had been used against them and still had an edge. The second time was in June, when I told her I was going to contact you directly if she didn't. She told me that if I did, she would tell our parents something about me that He stopped. Something she had leverage with, I said. Yes? And the third time? Last night, he said, after I saw you at the gathering. I called her on the way home and I told her it was over, that I was going to contact you regardless of what she did with the information about me, that what she was doing to you was wrong and I was done being complicit in it by staying quiet. He looked at me directly. She hung up. I looked at Declan Marsh across a diner table on a Saturday morning and I performed the rapid sequential assessment I had been performing all week. What was true here? What was performance? What was the shape of the motivation underneath the words? What I saw was a man who was genuinely uncomfortable, genuinely conflicted, and genuinely angry at himself for the 7 months during which he had allowed someone else's leverage to override his own sense of what was right. I recognized that particular self-anger. I had been living inside my own version of it for 10 days. Tell me everything, I said. From the beginning. He told me. The everything took 45 minutes and 2 refills of coffee and a silence in the middle, where neither of us spoke for nearly a minute because what he had just said required sitting with before anything else could be added to it. The thing he told me in the middle of the everything, the thing that required the silence, was this. Vivian had not met Clifton by accident. She had been introduced to him through a professional contact, and that introduction had not been random. Vivian had known, before she met Clifton, that he was married to me. She had known because of Declan, because years ago, before Declan had lost touch with me, he had mentioned me to his family in the way you mention people who matter to you, had mentioned my name, the city I lived in, enough detail that when Vivian, years later, encountered a man named Clifton Voss, whose wife was named Serena, the connection had been available to her. She knew who you were, Declan said, before she pursued him. She knew. The silence. Why? I said finally. Declan looked at his coffee cup. This was the part, I understood, that he had been most dreading. Because Vivian has always, she has a pattern of wanting things that belong to other people, of measuring her own value by displacement. He said it with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been watching a pattern for a long time and has never found the right language for it. I don't think she chose Clifton because of you specifically. I think she chose him, and the fact that he was yours made him more interesting to her, not less. I sat with this. I thought about the blue folder, about the printed photographs, preserved with the care of someone documenting something precious. I thought about Clifton's face at the gathering, performing the elaborate choreography of not looking at Vivian across a room full of his colleagues and his wife. I thought about 18 months of client dinners and work calls in the backyard and a marriage being hollowed out from the inside while I passed the bread and washed the dishes and looked faithfully slightly to the left of what was happening. I thought about the word displacement. "Declan," I said. "Yes." "What is the thing she has leverage over you with?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he told me that too, and the architecture of it, the full, terrible, precise architecture of what had been built inside my life without my knowledge, finally came completely into view. I filed in November of 2016. I want to walk you through the 4 weeks between the diner and the filing, because I think those 4 weeks contain the part of this story that is most important and most invisible. The part that happens inside a person when they are doing the hardest work of their life without anyone watching. The Monday after the diner, I called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Osei, and she had been recommended to me by a colleague who had been through her own divorce 3 years earlier and described Patricia with the specific reverence people reserve for professionals who saved them. Patricia was 50, precise, and had the particular quality of stillness that the best lawyers share with the best surgeons. An absolute absence of wasted motion, every word placed exactly where it needed to go. I sat across from her desk and I told her everything. The blue folder, the photographs, the timeline, the gathering, Declan, Vivian, the 7 months, the deliberate introduction, the displacement, the leverage. I laid it out in the sequential, organized way I had been constructing it for 10 days, and Patricia listened without interrupting, taking notes in a small leather notebook with a pen she uncapped and recapped with the rhythm of someone thinking hard. When I finished, she looked at her notes, then at me. "You've done a significant amount of work already," she said. "I'm a project manager," I said. "It's what I do." "The photographs in the filing cabinet," she said. "Did you remove them?" "No, I left them exactly as I found them." "Good." She made a note. "The down payment on the house, you said it came primarily from your savings?" 83%, I said. "I have documentation." Something shifted in Patricia's expression. Fractionally, professionally contained, but I caught it. "Also good," she said. We spent 2 hours in that first meeting. When I left, I had a legal strategy, a timeline, and the specific steadiness that comes from handing part of a weight to someone qualified to help carry it. I sat in my car in the parking structure outside Patricia's building, and I allowed myself, for exactly 7 minutes, to feel everything I had been not feeling for the past 2 weeks. It was a great deal of feeling. It moved through me like weather, the grief first, which surprised me with its size, because I had thought the discovery would have cauterized the love, and found instead that they were not in the same location and the grief did not care what the evidence said. Then the anger, which did not surprise me with its size because I had been aware of its dimensions for 2 weeks. Then something underneath both of them that was harder to name, something that felt, distantly and improbably, like the first thin edge of relief, the relief of knowing, the relief of the uncertainty being over, even if what had replaced it was devastating, the relief of not having to look slightly to the left anymore. After the 7 minutes, I started the car and drove home and made dinner and passed the bread and said the appropriate things in the appropriate places. And Clifton had no idea that the walls of the life we shared had already been handed to a lawyer to be systematically dismantled. I told Clifton on a Sunday morning 3 weeks later. Not with drama, Not with the photographs on the table or the accusations or the constructed confrontation that the anger in me had occasionally rehearsed in the 3 a.m. hours. I told him in the kitchen, over coffee, in the same kitchen where I had stood at the sink 9 days after finding the folder and understood that the marriage no longer existed. I told him simply and directly that I knew about Vivian, that I had retained a lawyer, and that I would be moving out of the house by the end of the month. Clifton went very still. Then he said, "How long have you known?" "Long enough," I said. "Serena, I don't need explanations," I said. "I don't need the conversation where you tell me how it happened, or what it meant, or what you were going through. I'm not interested in that conversation. I'm interested in making this process as clean and functional as possible, which requires us to communicate through our lawyers from this point forward." He looked at me with an expression I had not seen before, or perhaps had not been willing to see before. Something that was part guilt and part assessment. The look of a man recalculating the variables in a situation he thought he understood. He had expected, I think, a different version of this moment. Tears, maybe. Pleading. The performance of a woman undone. He had underestimated, thoroughly and consequentially, the 3 weeks I had spent quietly preparing. "Where will you go?" he said. "That's not your concern," I said. I moved into a furnished apartment on the north side of the city. It was smaller than the house, with windows that faced a courtyard instead of the backyard that needed work. And it was mine in a way that nothing had felt entirely mine in 6 years. I unpacked my things over 2 days and arranged them without negotiation and stood in the kitchen on the second evening making dinner for one and felt the specific, unfamiliar texture of a life that belonged only to me. It was terrifying. It was the most alive I had felt in years. The divorce proceedings took 4 months. Patricia was as precise in the courtroom as she was in her office, and the documentation I had kept, the down payment records, the financial history, the careful accounting of what I had brought to the marriage and what had been done with it, served its purpose with the efficiency of information that has been organized by someone who knows how to organize information. Clifton did not contest the major points. I think the photographs in the filing cabinet had something to do with that. The specific vulnerability of a man who knows that evidence exists and has been seen and could be introduced at any moment tends to redirect the appetite for confrontation. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in March of 2017. I signed the papers in Patricia's office, in the same chair where I had sat 5 months earlier, and laid out the architecture of what had been done to my life. Patricia handed me the finalized documents, and I looked at them for a moment, at my name, at the date, at the legal language that drew a line under 6 years and said, "Here is where that ends," and I felt the thing I had not expected to feel. Not sadness, though that was there. Not anger, though that was there too, smaller now and less consuming. What I felt, primarily and clearly, was the same thin edge of relief I had felt in the parking structure outside Patricia's building 5 months ago, but wider now. A door opened rather than just cracked. I walked out of Patricia's building into a March afternoon and I called Renata, my closest friend, who had known everything from the beginning and had managed, through 4 months of proceedings, to be both completely present and completely non-directive in the way that only the best people can manage. And I said, "It's done." She said, "How do you feel?" "Like I can breathe in a direction I forgot existed," I said. She laughed. I laughed. We made plans for dinner. I was driving to meet her when my phone rang. The number was Declan's. We had been in careful, occasional contact through the proceedings. The specific contact of 2 people navigating an overlap of situations that required coordination without yet knowing what the contact was or where it was going. He had testified, briefly and precisely, to what he had told me in the diner when Patricia had needed the account of Vivian's prior knowledge documented. He had done it without being asked twice and without softening anything to protect his sister. It had cost him something with his family. I knew that. I had not asked him to pay that cost, and he had paid it anyway. "It's done?" he said when I answered. "Just signed," I said. "How do you feel?" I laughed. The second time in 10 minutes, which felt significant after 4 months of infrequent laughing. Everyone is asking me that. It's a reasonable question. I feel like I can breathe, I said. I feel like the ground is solid again. A pause. The unhurried kind that had always been characteristic of him. I'm glad, he said. Declan, I said. Yeah. Thank you. For the diner. For the testimony. For... I stopped, trying to find the right perimeter for what I was thanking him for. For deciding to be the kind of person who doesn't stay quiet. Another pause. Longer. I should have been that person 7 months earlier, he said. I want you to know I know that. I know you know that, I said. Dinner sometime? A beat, then, yes, he said. I'd like that. I drove to meet Renata with the windows down in the first genuinely warm evening of the year, and the air came through the car and the city went past outside the glass, and I was 34 years old and newly untethered and terrified and free and completely uncertain about what came next. It was, I would understand later, exactly the right way to begin. There is a version of this story where the divorce is the ending, where the papers get signed, the apartment gets furnished, the ground becomes solid again, and the narrative closes on a woman who survived something and came out the other side, and that is enough. That is the whole story. I understand the appeal of that version. It is clean. It has a shape. It lets everyone go home feeling that justice has a reliable address and that the people who deserve good things eventually receive them. That is not this story, because the ending was not the divorce. The divorce was the clearing, the removal of the structure that had been built on a foundation that was never what I thought it was, the demolition that has to happen before anything real can be constructed in the space. The ending, or rather, the beginning that wore the clothing of an ending, was what came after, what got built in the cleared ground, what arrived, slowly and without announcement, in the 14 months between March of 2017 and the May evening in 2018, when I understood that my life had become something I had not known enough to plan for. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Vivian first, because her part of this story is not finished yet. Vivian Marsh called me once during the divorce proceedings. Once, on a Wednesday evening in January of 2017, from a number I didn't recognize. She had been careful, throughout everything, to keep herself at a remove from the legal process, to exist in it only as a name in documents rather than a voice in a room. The call came through at 8:17 in the evening. I was at my kitchen table reviewing documents Patricia had sent. I answered because I had been answering unknown numbers carefully since October, understanding that unknown numbers sometimes carried information. Serena. Her voice was not what I expected. I had constructed over 3 months of knowing her name and her face and the outline of what she had done, a particular imaginary version of her voice, something with an edge, something that matched the precision of what she had done. The voice on the phone was different. Quieter, less certain. Vivian, I said. A pause. I want to explain, I'm going to stop you there, I said. I'm not interested in an explanation. My lawyer has advised me not to have this conversation and I'm going to follow that advice. But I want to say one thing before I hang up. Silence on the line. What you did was not about Clifton, I said. Clifton made his own choices and he's responsible for them. But what you did, knowing who I was before you walked into my marriage, choosing it anyway, choosing it partly because of what you knew, that was about me specifically, and I want you to know that I know that. Not so you'll apologize. I don't need your apology. I just need you to know that I saw it clearly, that I see you clearly. The silence that followed was long enough that I thought she might have hung up. Then she said very quietly, Declan told you everything. Declan told me the truth, I said. That's not the same thing as everything. Goodbye, Vivian. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for a moment. Then I went back to the documents. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment because I think it matters. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel the clean satisfaction of a confrontation well executed. What I felt was something more like completion. The closing of a loop that had been open since the blue folder fell on the floor of the office. I had seen the thing clearly, and I had said so to the person who had done it. That was all I needed. I never heard from Vivian again. The dinner with Declan happened in April of 2017. A month after the divorce was finalized, on a Wednesday evening at a restaurant neither of us had chosen for any particular reason except that it was equidistant between our apartments and had good reviews and was not the waterfront restaurant in any of the photographs, which was the only criterion I had specified when he suggested we choose somewhere. We sat across from each other the way we had in the diner 6 months earlier, except that the coffee had been replaced by wine and the urgency had been replaced by something more spacious. The diner conversation had been two people in the middle of a situation managing information and implication and the live wire of what was currently happening. This was something else. Two people at the end of something or the beginning of something sitting in the particular openness of a cleared space. We talked for 3 hours. About the 11 years between 22 and 34, the lives we had each built in the distance between the apartment complex where we had known each other briefly and wherever we were now. He was a structural engineer, which made me laugh because the word structural had been living in my mind for months as a descriptor for everything Clifton and Vivian had dismantled. And here was a man whose entire professional life was about understanding what things were made of and whether they could hold weight. He had been in a relationship for 4 years that had ended in 2015, cleanly and mutually, and without the specific wreckage that mine had involved. He still owned one good jacket, he mentioned, which he had retired from all-occasion use but kept for events that specifically warranted it. I told him about the project management, the firm, the particular satisfaction of being the person in a complex system who understands how all the pieces connect. I told him about Patricia and the 4 months of proceedings and the March afternoon when I had driven away from the lawyer's office with the windows down. I told him, and this surprised me, that I was willing to tell it this early, about the 7 minutes in the parking structure when I had let myself feel everything at once, the grief and the anger and the relief, before starting the car and driving home to make dinner and pass the bread one more time. He listened the way he had always listened, with the complete and unhurried attention of someone who is not waiting for you to finish so they can speak, but is actually present in what you're saying while you're saying it. I had forgotten that about him. Or perhaps I had never fully registered it at 22, when I had not yet accumulated enough experience with people who didn't listen to properly appreciate the ones who did. "Can I ask you something?" he said, near the end of the evening. "Yes," I said. "The 7 months," he said. "I've thought about it a lot. The decision I made to not contact you when Vivian threatened me. I've thought about whether there was a version of it where I made a different choice regardless of the threat, and I think there was. I think I could have made a different choice. I want you to know I know that, not just as something I said in the diner, but as something I've actually sat with." I looked at him across the table. "What was the threat?" I said. "You told me she had a leverage. You told me what it was in the diner. I'm asking now about the weight of it. Whether, sitting with it, it still feels like it justified 7 months." He was quiet. "No," he said. "It doesn't." "Okay," I said. "That's it?" he said. "Okay." "People make decisions under pressure that they wouldn't make otherwise," I said. "The question I care about is what they do when the pressure changes. You called me from an unknown number on a Saturday morning. You showed up to the diner. You testified." I paused. "You decided to be the kind of person who tells the truth when it costs something. That's what I care about." Something in his face settled, the specific settling of a person who has been carrying a weight and has been, carefully and deliberately, relieved of some of it. We split the bill, walked out into the April evening, which was doing the particular thing April evenings do in this city, warm enough to be outside without a coat, with a quality of light that was neither day nor quite dark, the transitional glow of a season that hasn't fully committed yet. We stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, and neither of us moved immediately toward our respective cars. "Wednesday next week?" he said. "Wednesday next week," I said. I drove home with the windows down again. The second time. It was becoming a habit. The Wednesdays accumulated through spring and into summer, not quickly. Neither of us was interested in quick, having both recently emerged from situations that had moved at speeds calibrated to other people's needs. Slowly, with the particular deliberateness of two people who are paying close attention to what is actually happening, rather than what they want to be happening, the dinners became the thing I looked forward to most in my week. I want to be honest about the complications, because there were complications. The obvious one, that his sister had been the specific instrument of the worst thing that had happened to me, did not disappear because the divorce was final, or because Declan had testified, or because Vivian had called once, and I had said what I needed to say, and hung up. It lived in the space between us with a particular persistence. There were evenings when I looked at his face and saw, in the bone structure that families share, an echo of hers, and felt something cold move through me. There were moments when the question of what it meant, to be building something with the brother of the person who had done what she had done, required a sitting with that I could not hurry. I talked to a therapist about it. Her name was Dr. Amara Finley, and she had an office near my apartment, and a directness that I found, after an adult life of performing ease, profoundly restoring. She did not tell me what to do. She asked questions that illuminated the actual structure of what I was navigating rather than the emotional surface of it. "What is the thing you're most afraid of?" she asked in our 5th session in August of 2017, when I had been describing the complication. I thought about it honestly. "That I'm choosing him because of what happened," I said. "That he's become meaningful to me partly because of the role he played, because he was the person who told me the truth when it cost him something, and I'm confusing gratitude with something else." Dr. Finley looked at me with the calm focus she brought to everything. "Is that what it feels like?" she asked. "When you're with him?" I thought about the April evening outside the restaurant, the Wednesday accumulation, the unhurried listening, the one good jacket. "No," I said, "it doesn't feel like gratitude." "What does it feel like?" I looked at the window in her office, at the summer light coming through it. "Like the ground is solid," I said, "like I'm moving at my own speed, like I'm being seen by someone who is actually looking." Dr. Finley made a small note. "That sounds different from gratitude," she said. "Yes?" I said. "It does." In September of 2017, Clifton moved to another city. I heard about it from Patricia, who heard about it through the professional periphery that legal proceedings create. He had taken a position at a firm in a different state, reportedly with Vivian. The information arrived vague and secondhand, as information about people who are no longer in your life tends to arrive, stripped of detail and urgency. I received it and set it down and found that it had very little weight. What Clifton did next was not a story I needed to follow. He had made his choices and they had led him to where they led him. The chapter had a last page. I had turned it. What I did not expect, what arrived in October of 2017 with the specific force of something you have been circling without knowing you were circling it, was the conversation that changed the temperature of everything between Declan and me. We were in my apartment on a Sunday afternoon, doing the ordinary domestic thing of being in the same space without agenda. He was reading, I was working on a project brief, the afternoon light making long rectangles on the floor. The particular ease of it was something I had not had in my adult life. The ease of coexisting with someone without the constant low-level monitoring, the checking of the room's temperature, the management of variables that proximity to Clifton had always required. I looked up from my work and I looked at him, at the top of his head bent over his book, at the one good jacket hung over the back of the chair because we had been out earlier and he had not yet taken it home. And I understood, with the same quality of clarity that had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in October of the previous year, that something had become true that I had not yet said out loud. "Declan," I said. He looked up. "I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to actually hear it, not as a statement that requires an immediate response, but as something I'm telling you because it's true and I think you should know it." He set his book down. "Okay," he said. "I love you," I said, "not because of what you did or the role you played or what it means in the context of everything that happened. I love you because of who you are in this room on a Sunday afternoon, and who you've been every Wednesday evening, and the way you listen, and the way you're unhurried, and the way you decided to be the kind of person who tells the truth when it costs something. I love you for those things specifically, and I wanted to say it clearly so it was said. The afternoon light moved on the floor. Declan looked at me for a long moment with the complete attention he gave to things he wanted to understand fully before he responded. Then he said, "I've been trying to find the right time to say that to you for 3 months." "There's never a right time," I said. "You just say it." "Yes," he said. "You do." A pause. "I love you, Serena." Outside, the October city continued its ordinary business. Inside, in my apartment with the windows facing the courtyard and the long rectangles of afternoon light on the floor, something settled into place with the quiet finality of a thing that has been waiting to arrive for exactly as long as it needed to. It is May of 2019, and I am standing in the kitchen of an apartment I have never stood in before. Not mine. Not Declan's current apartment, which I know well enough to navigate in the dark, which smells like coffee and engineering textbooks and the particular accumulated scent of a space that two people have been moving through together for the better part of a year. This is a new apartment, larger, with windows on 2 sides, in a building 4 blocks from the one I moved into on the night I first understood what it felt like to inhabit a life that belonged entirely to me. It has a kitchen with more counter space than either of our current kitchens, and a second bedroom that could be a guest room or an office, or, as Declan had said when the realtor showed it to us last week, whatever we decide it needs to be. Whatever we decide it needs to be. I stand in the kitchen of the apartment we have just signed a lease on together, and I look at the windows and the morning light coming through them, and I think about a Tuesday afternoon in October of 2016, a blue folder on the floor of an office, and the specific quality of stillness that descends on a person when they are holding evidence that rearranges everything they thought they knew about their own life. I think about how the rearrangement looked from inside it like destruction, how the cleared ground looked for a long time only like clearing, how the thing that was built in the aftermath, slowly, improbably, with the deliberateness of two people who had each survived something and were paying close attention to what they were building and why, looked nothing like what I would have planned if planning had been available to me. It is better than what I would have planned. That is the thing I could not have told you in October of 2016, or March of 2017, or even the Sunday afternoon in October when I said the true thing out loud and it was received with the complete attention it deserved. I could not have told you then how much better. I know now. 2 years changes the texture of everything. The divorce receded in the way that acute things do when time and distance and new experience accumulate over them, not erased, not irrelevant, but no longer the largest thing in the room. Clifton existed somewhere in another city with or without Vivian. I genuinely did not know and genuinely did not need to. The blue folder existed in my memory as the specific coordinates of a turning point, the place where the road forked and the fork led, eventually here. I was not grateful for what Clifton had done. I was not going to perform a narrative in which betrayal becomes gift. What I was honest about the arithmetic of it, that the life I was living in May of 2019 was better than the life I had been living in October of 2016, and that without the rupture there would have been no clearing, and without the clearing there would have been no construction, and the construction was something I would not trade. That is not forgiveness. That is just accounting. Patricia Osei had sent a card when the divorce was finalized. A simple card, professionally brief, wishing you well in the next chapter. I had kept it in a drawer. I looked at it sometimes, not with sentimentality, but with the specific appreciation I felt for every person who had appeared at the right moment with exactly what was needed. Patricia with her leather notebook and her precision. Dr. Finley with her directness and her questions that illuminated rather than directed. Renata, who had known everything from the beginning and had been completely present and completely non-directive, who had answered my call on the March afternoon the papers were signed and laughed with me and made dinner plans. The chosen architecture of a life. The people who show up and hold things steady while you figure out what you're building. The complication of Vivian. I want to tell you how that resolved because I think honesty requires it. It did not resolve cleanly. That is the truthful answer. Declan's relationship with his sister was damaged in a way that a year and a half of time had not fully repaired, and I think the honest assessment was that it might never fully repair, that some fractures, once made, change the structure of a thing permanently even when they knit. He saw her occasionally at family events that required it, and the interactions were functional and civil and not warm. She had not apologized to him for the leverage she had used. She had not, as far as I knew, apologized to anyone for anything. Some people are not able to arrive at the accounting their actions require. That is a truth I had made my peace with, not because it was acceptable, but because my peace was not contingent on her arriving there. What I had not expected was the conversation Declan relayed to me in January of 2018, after a family event he had attended without me. A conversation in which Vivian had asked about me, carefully and obliquely, in the way of someone who does not want to be caught asking. Had asked if I was well. Had asked, in the specific phrasing Declan quoted to me, whether I seemed like myself. I sat with that for a long time. Like herself. The question of a person who remembered, somewhere underneath everything, that there had been a self-worth asking about. Not enough, not nearly enough, but something, a data point, a fragment of evidence that the architecture of what she had done had weight in her too, that she carried some version of it. I did not reach out. I had said what I needed to say on the phone in January of 2017 and the loop was closed. But I stopped after Declan told me about the conversation, constructing her entirely as the instrument of what had been done to me. I allowed her to be more complicated than that, not for her benefit, but for mine. Because I had learned in 2 years of building a life in cleared ground that the people who hurt us are almost never only that, and that insisting on the flatness of them requires a sustained effort that costs something you need for better purposes. It costs less to let people be complicated, even the ones who made themselves into weapons pointed at your life. Dr. Finley and I had our last session in February of 2019, not because the work was finished, I'm not sure the work is ever finished, but because what it needed to be in the immediate term had been completed, and we had arrived together at a natural resting point. She had the particular quality of a good therapist at the end of a productive relationship, satisfied without being congratulatory, aware that what she was watching was not a completion but a sufficiency. "How do you feel about where you are?" she asked in the last session. I thought about the apartment with the windows on 2 sides, the signed lease, whatever we decide it needs to be. "Like I built something real," I said. "Like the ground under it is actually solid, not just performing solidity." "What's the difference?" she asked. "When it was performing," I said, "I always knew somewhere underneath that it could stop, that the performance required maintenance, that if I stopped managing the variables, it would reveal itself as something other than what it looked like." I paused. "This doesn't feel like that." "What does it feel like?" "Like it's made of the right materials," I said. "Like someone checked the structure." Dr. Finley smiled. "That's a very good answer for someone in a relationship with a structural engineer." I laughed, the unguarded laugh of a person who is genuinely, unexpectedly in the right place. I want to tell you what I know now that I did not know in October of 2016, standing in an office holding a blue folder with the world rearranging itself around me. I know that the looking slightly to the left, the sustained, faithful, exhausting practice of accepting explanations that required me to not quite see what was actually happening, was not a character flaw. It was a learned behavior installed over years of a relationship that required it. And unlearning it required not just the rupture of discovery, but the slow, unglamorous work of choosing, repeatedly, in small moments and large ones, to look directly at the thing in front of me and call it what it was. Dr. Finley helped with that. Declan helped with that. Not by fixing it, but by being a person who made direct looking feel safe rather than dangerous. I know that the word displacement, the word Declan had used in the diner to describe Vivian's pattern, the measuring of value by what you can take from someone else, is a poverty, a fundamental impoverishment of the self, that the people who operate from displacement are not powerful, despite the damage they can do. They are people who have not found the thing that is actually theirs, and so reach for what belongs to others, not understanding that ownership doesn't transfer that way. What is actually yours, what you build from your own materials at your own pace in cleared ground, cannot be displaced. It can be damaged, it can be interrupted, but it cannot be taken because it is not a thing. It is a practice, a daily decision about who you are and what you're building and whether the foundation is real. I know that the people who tell you the truth when it costs them something are among the rarest and most valuable people in the world. That the moment Declan called from an unknown number on a Saturday morning and said, "I need to tell you something," was one of the most important moments of my life. Not because of what it led to eventually, but because of what it demonstrated immediately. That a person existed who would choose truth over safety, who would accept the cost of clarity rather than pass it to someone else. I know that signing divorce papers on a Thursday in March and driving away with the windows down is not a failure. It is the end of a performance that was costing more than it gave. It is the beginning of a different relationship with your own life, one in which you are the person making the choices rather than the person managing around someone else's. I know that 2 years is enough time for the ground to become completely, genuinely different, for a life to become something you did not know enough to plan for and would not trade for the one you had. For a kitchen with windows on 2 sides and a second bedroom that can become whatever you decide it needs to be to feel like the most specific and accurate description of hope you have ever stood inside. On the morning we picked up the keys to the new apartment, Declan and I stood in the empty living room with coffee cups from the place on the corner and the May light coming through both sets of windows at once, filling the room from 2 directions the way rooms with windows on 2 sides are filled. "Well," he said. "Well," I said. He looked at the room with the focused assessment of someone who understands structure, who has spent a professional life asking whether things are made of the right materials, whether they can hold the weight they're being asked to hold. Then he looked at me with the same assessment, the complete, unhurried attention. "It's good," he said, simply. "It's good," I said. We drank our coffee in the May light, and the room was empty and full at the same time. The way rooms are when they are waiting to become what you decide they need to be, when the ground beneath them is solid and the materials are right, and the people standing in them have already proven to each other and to themselves that they know how to build something that holds. I thought about the blue folder, the deadbolt that wasn't mine, a different door, a different story, but the same fundamental lesson about what it costs to find out the truth about the life you're actually living. The truth had cost everything. It had given back more. I finished my coffee, set the cup down on the windowsill where there was no furniture yet to set it on, looked at the room that was ours, and I began.